Similar to shared example groups in RSpec, this is another feature called shared contexts that allows you to share common methods, before blocks, subjects, and let blocks across multiple specs. This is a great way to dry up your RSpec code and is a little bit different than having shared modules with methods because of specifically the block sharing. So let's start. We won't start from scratch today. We'll start from the last example, which was or a recent episode about shared example groups, which allows you to share examples like it does X across multiple files. We'll build upon that and we'll make something called RSpec shared contexts. Let's go into that. And let's make sure our tests pass. All right, RSpec works. That's great. This code, if you haven't watched the other episode, is really simple. We have a recipe, we have an ingredient, we have a module URLable that they both include that generates a URL for them, and that is really it. There's also a user class that's also URLable. So the specs for those are pretty simple. It has an ID, and then it behaves like an object with a URL. See the shared example groups for that. But let's see, I want to make something a little bit better, or I want to show shared contexts that will improve some code. But we got to write some duplicative code that we then want to dry up. So here we have an ingredient, and really we want ingredient to belong to a recipe. So we'll say let recipe is recipe.new, and we'll, as always, slightly contrived, but it should be pretty helpful soon, or clear why it's helpful. We need to require recipe. Let's get these tests green. Okay, tests are green. Let's also introduce a class called instructions, because you can imagine a recipe would have a set of instructions. So it would have a list. It would have a list of ingredients, and then it would have a set of instructions. So we'll have this. We'll say instructions. It won't have our shared example, and it won't even have an ID. We'll just say it has text, and we'll say text to equal foo, and we'll say instructions is, instructions, and we'll say instructions has text. So we'll just make the text do this. We've got that, but we want to pass it into a recipe. We'll run the tests. We don't have that class. Instructions, RB, class, instructions. Run the test again. Run the test again. And it has two params, so text and recipe. So we'll say text, recipe, so text is equal to text, recipe is equal to recipe. We'll say add a reader, text. Okay, the tests are green. That's what we want. Now we get into shared contexts. This is a simplistic example that you'll need to be able to see how you can then extract it, and it becomes really powerful. And I'll give some other examples of where I used it past this simple example. So in your spec directory, we have shared examples here. We can create a directory called shared contexts. And you'll have, you could have multiples of these, so it really helps to do that. And we'll create a file called withrecipe.rb. And we'll say rspec.sharedContext. We'll call it withrecipe. And we'll say here, take that out. And here we'll take this out because we won't need it. Let's run the tests. It fails because it says undefined local variable or method recipe. So then we'll say here it has, let me just look at RSpec really quick to see what its include context with recipe, because we called the shared context with recipe here. Run that again. Can't find the shared context, so we need to require that. And we'll just use require relative to be a little lazy. Shared context. All right, that passes again. Now, why? It's because this recipe comes from the let block in here. This is really nice because if we have a bunch of specs that have a very similar setup, we can really dry up the code and not have to repeat that all the time. Also, let's say recipe changes here, and then let's say, okay, recipe now has a name, and we call it granola. Instead of having to go through here and add a name to all of them, we can just do it in one place. And that's really, really helpful. I'll give some more examples in a sec about how that's useful, but let's add this to here. Okay, so that uses params instead of keys. So that's why we can pass in name granola and our tests don't break. I just wanted to see why that was. So that's context. Things where it gets powerful is you could say ID or 1. That fails because ID is not example. You could do let's say recipe ID. Here's how you do that. You wouldn't do what I just did. You would say, you could do something like this, recipe ID. And this is where scoping comes in. So our tests all pass, but let's say we instead wanted to, let's change it to be name actually, because I think that's better, a default name. So ID, sure, we could override that, but let's instead say recipe name. Let's make sure our tests pass really quick. Yep, they pass. Let's say we wanted to be, for some reason, our tests required the recipe name to be different. You can override it with your let blocks where you include the context. So we could say recipe name, and instead of granola, we could say pizza dough. And this is silly, but we can just say it has a recipe with a name. Expect subject.recipe.name to equal pizza dough. This is a bad example because we're just kind of, I'm making it work, but you know, here we would say name, run it again, it fails, undefined method recipe for ingredient. Oh yeah, because we're working in ingredient. Well, we'll just add that. Recipe is recipe. Oh my gosh, I really, I started using key params in one and the other examples don't. Sorry about that. This would just be params name like we did in the other place. This is a little sloppy, I'm sorry. Run it. Our problem is, what is our problem? I'm having trouble seeing. Oh yeah, so this becomes this, that becomes that. It's saying undefined method name for nil class. That's because this needs to be recipe, name, recipe, run it again. Okay, it passes. Now, why that's useful? Well, you'll notice in your code when it becomes useful, but you can override shared contexts lets where you include the context. So, you know, that allows us to dry up our specs. It allows us to, but still leverage the scoping that you get with let. And you can imagine, I'll talk about a real example now. Now that we're done with this contrived fake example. I built a PayPal client, which I think I talked about, and in the shared example groups episode. And yes, it has behaviors. Each request is a class, and each of them has a behavior of it behaves like a request. But what also exists is a bunch of setup that is needed to configure the request. And by creating a context that dries up the code and maintains it in one place, it makes it a lot easier to change, and then it can be overridden where needed. So that's the real benefit here, is you can create the base foundation for bootstrapping tests with shared needs, have it be in one place, and then easily override it and change it. As always, I hope this was helpful. Shared contexts are interesting. They're kind of like a cousin to shared example groups. They're really useful for taking your RSpec code and making that a little bit better to stand them up, and makes it a little bit easier to change things when maybe your interfaces change. All right, that's it for this episode. As always, thank you very much. See you next time.